The marble walls of the Supreme Court chamber shimmered under cold white light, holding the kind of silence that makes a heartbeat sound like thunder. Reporters leaned in, pens suspended. The air smelled faintly of polished wooden nerves. Then, like a blade cutting through calm water, Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward. His voice was slow, deliberate, heavy with the authority of decades. "Congresswoman," he said, his gaze fixed on Jasmine Crockett, "your grasp of constitutional law appears basic at best." The room froze. Cameras clicked in mechanical rhythm. Someone in the gallery whispered a prayer. Crockett didn't flinch. Her fingers rested lightly on a stack of notes, neat, color-coded, precise. Behind her, the faint reflection of the nation's flag shimmered in the glass panel, like history itself waiting to see how she'd respond. Outside, protesters chanted for voting rights. Inside, the tension crackled like static. Every face turned toward her, the first-term Congresswoman from Texas, black, bold, and outnumbered. The moment was designed to break her. It was power flexing itself, daring her to tremble, but Crockett didn't blink. Instead, she took a slow breath, the kind you take when you decide that fear will not own you. She looked up, meeting his eyes, not with defiance, but with clarity. "Justice Thomas," she began softly, her tone even, her rhythm deliberate. "It's an interesting claim, especially from someone who's benefited most when the law stretched to include people it once excluded." A low murmur rippled through the chamber. Reporters jolted upright. Thomas's expression tightened, the faintest flicker of surprise breaking through his polished calm. Crockett didn't look away for a heartbeat. It felt as if the entire country was watching through the lens of a single camera, the old guard staring down the new generation. In that silence, dignity met power. And power blinked first. She turned a page in her notes, her fingers steady, her voice calm. "If we're going to discuss constitutional literacy, Justice, perhaps we should begin with who the Constitution was written for, and who had to fight to be counted by it." The gallery erupted in a restrained gasp. Thomas leaned back, lips tightening, but no one expected how she'd answer him next. Outside the Supreme Court, the morning was anything but quiet. Waves of protesters lined the marble steps, their signs clashing in color and conviction. One side chanted for fairness, their voices hoarse from hours in the cold. The other raised flags and slogans about integrity and tradition, as if those words could erase centuries of struggle. Between them, news cameras rolled nonstop, narrating a battle that had long outgrown the courtroom. This was more than a hearing, it was the reckoning of a promise America made and never fully kept. The case, officially titled Crockett v. The Commission on Electoral Integrity, carried stakes that went beyond legal precedent. At its heart was a single question: should newly drawn voting districts erase the political power of minority communities under the banner of reform? Cable news networks branded it the trial for the soul of democracy. The phrase stuck. Across living rooms, diners, and classrooms, Americans tuned in not just for legal arguments but for something rawer, recognition. In Atlanta, a retired teacher whispered, "I remember when my father couldn't vote." In Phoenix, a young organizer live-streamed the protests, her caption reading, "If this fails, so do we." The nation had turned the courthouse into a mirror, and what it reflected was uncomfortable. One country, two realities. Inside, reporters whispered between themselves. Even veteran correspondents, hardened by years of political theater, felt a charge in the air. This wasn't the usual hearing. It felt like history was tightening its grip, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak the truth plainly. At the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, the woman many saw as democracy's unexpected defender. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't a polished senator with legacy connections or Ivy League pedigree. She was a public defender turned congresswoman who'd clawed her way into rooms that weren't built for her. To some, she represented the chaos of a changing America. To others, she was proof that change could still stand tall under oath. Networks split-screened her every move. Conservative pundits mocked her presence, a political stunt dressed up as justice. Progressive voices countered, "No, this is what representation looks like." On social media, her supporters posted side-by-side images, Thomas's solemn glare next to Crockett's steady gaze, with the caption, "Old Power. New Voice." The contrast was electric. Every second inside that chamber carried the weight of generations. The Supreme Court, once seen as untouchable marble, now felt human, fragile, trembling under the pressure of what it symbolized. Somewhere in the crowd outside, a child hoisted a cardboard sign above her head, "Count me in." A camera zoomed in, capturing the innocence of that phrase against the vast backdrop of the court. The image went viral within minutes. It became the thumbnail of the day, hope standing small but unbroken against the architecture of power back inside. Justice Thomas adjusted his glasses. He knew what this moment meant. So did Crockett. Their exchange wasn't just about constitutional interpretation, it was about the right to belong in a nation that still debated who belonged at all. The gavel struck once, echoing like thunder through the chamber. Reporters raised their pens. Protesters outside went silent, sensing a shift they couldn't yet name, and as Jasmine Crockett straightened her papers, her eyes flickered toward the rows of portraits hanging above, the faces of men who had never imagined someone like her standing here, speaking law to power. The questioning was about to begin, and when it did, history leaned forward in its seat. Before the confrontation that would shake the chamber, there was Clarence Thomas, the most silent voice on the bench, and yet one of the loudest forces shaping American law. For decades, he had sat behind that immovable expression, the portrait of composure, while his rulings quietly redrew the boundaries of equality. To the untrained eye, he was stoic. To those who watched closely, he was a strategist who learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. Thomas's story had once been celebrated as the embodiment of the American dream, a boy born into poverty in the Deep South, raised by a strict grandfather, climbing his way through Yale Law and into the nation's highest court. It was the story America loved to tell itself: struggle, merit, triumph. But somewhere along the way, that narrative hardened into something else, a man who rose from oppression only to wield the tools of power against those still trapped beneath it. He had become the conservative movement's cornerstone, a voice that gave intellectual weight to ideology. Decade after decade, his rulings chipped away at protections once won through sweat and sacrifice. Affirmative action? Weakened. Voting rights oversight? Gutted. His opinions, often brief but decisive, carried the weight of entire generations. He didn't need to shout. He only needed to sign. Behind closed doors, Thomas moved in circles that blurred law and politics, think tanks, private retreats, donor gatherings and secluded resorts. There, in hushed tones, he was treated less like a justice and more like an oracle. His word could shift millions in funding, sway legislation, and embolden governors who sought cover behind judicial philosophy. They called it originalism. His critics called it regression with a robe. Yet, to his defenders, Thomas was the embodiment of steadfast principle, a man unbent by public opinion, unshaken by scandal. But for every admirer, there were 10 who saw the hypocrisy, the justice who railed against privilege while basking in the comfort it provided. His silence in hearings wasn't humility, it was control. Each pause was a reminder that he didn't need validation from the world outside. When the Voting Rights Act's core protections were dismantled years earlier, it was Thomas who supported the opinion that states no longer needed federal oversight to prevent racial discrimination in elections. The nation has changed, the majority wrote. But on the ground, in counties where polling stations disappeared overnight and ballots became harder to cast, the nation hadn't changed nearly enough. For activists, Thomas's name became shorthand for betrayal. The son of the segregated South turned guardian of the very systems that once caged him. But for the powerful, he was indispensable. He gave moral cover to ambition, dressed inequality in the language of legal restraint. He rarely granted interviews. When he did, his tone was soft, almost tender, as if gentleness could mask the magnitude of his decisions. "The Constitution is not a living document," he once said. "It says what it says." To some, those words sounded like discipline. To others, like denial, a refusal to see the lives between the lines. In Washington, the myth of Clarence Thomas had become unshakable, the immovable justice, the final word, the man who could not be cornered. His chambers were said to operate like a fortress, efficient and impenetrable. Clerks came and went in reverent silence, aware that serving under him meant inheriting a worldview, one that favored order over empathy, tradition over change. Even his colleagues, seasoned justices with reputations of their own, learned to tread carefully. Few questioned him outright. His eyes, behind those thin glasses, carried the calm of someone who had already decided what he believed decades ago. For the public, he was a paradox, the man who spoke least but whose words lasted longest. His influence stretched beyond law reviews and courtrooms. It shaped legislatures, school boards, and dinner table arguments about what freedom really meant. And yet, beneath that power lay something colder, an unspoken resentment for a world that never stopped doubting him, and a determination to ensure that no one else would question his authority again. So when Jasmine Crockett entered that chamber, standing as both witness and challenger, she wasn't just facing a justice, she was facing a legacy. A living monument to contradiction, a man of color who had built his career defending systems that silenced his own, and for years, no one had dared confront him in his own domain. Judges feared the backlash. Politicians feared the headlines. Even seasoned attorneys softened their tone in his presence. He was the quiet thunder in the room, the one whose silence meant danger. Few dared challenge him publicly, until Jasmine Crockett walked in. Before Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the marble weight of the Supreme Court, she stood beneath Texas skies, wide, endless, and sometimes unforgiving. Her story didn't begin in the polished halls of Washington but in the dust and heat of Dallas, where voices rose louder than privilege could ignore. She grew up watching people fight battles they weren't supposed to win, tenants resisting evictions, mothers arguing for fair wages, young men pleading for a second chance in a system designed to deny it. Her father was a mechanic who fixed more cars than he ever drove. Her mother worked double shifts at a nursing home, hands roughened by years of care. From them, Jasmine learned early that dignity wasn't a luxury, it was survival. "We don't have much," her mother used to say, "but we have our name, and that means something." She carried that lesson into classrooms where she was often the only black girl sitting in the front row. Teachers called her outspoken, a polite way of saying she made them uncomfortable. But Jasmine knew silence never saved anyone. At night, while her friends drifted toward sleep, she sat under the faint glow of a desk lamp, reading old case files and watching courtroom reruns like they were sermons. She wasn't dreaming of power, she was studying how it spoke, how it twisted words into walls. Law school was brutal. The air there was colder, not from weather, but from entitlement. When professors quoted founding fathers, she heard the quiet absence of women who looked like her in those stories. When classmates debated theory, she thought about real people, single mothers facing eviction, young voters turned away from polling booths. She didn't just memorize the law, she translated it into human stakes. After graduation, she didn't choose the easy road. No corporate office. No cushioned paycheck. She went where justice was in shortest supply, the public defender's office. Her clients came in handcuffed and left with hope, not always freedom. She argued for men society had already written off, for families whose last names carried more suspicion than protection. Each case chipped away at her faith in the system but sharpened her faith in people. There were nights when she'd leave court after losing another case, drive to the edge of the city, park under an empty streetlight, and cry, not out of weakness, but because caring too much is a dangerous thing in a world that profits from apathy. And yet, every morning, she returned. New files. New faces. New fight. When voter suppression laws began to sweep across Texas, it was Jasmine who stood at community meetings with a microphone and a stack of legal forms. She explained registration deadlines like they were lifelines. She walked door to door, sunburned and hoarse, telling people their voice still mattered, even when the system was built to make them believe it didn't. Her rise to Congress wasn't an accident, it was an accumulation of late nights, unpaid hours, and relentless faith that America could still live up to its promises. Her opponents underestimated her every time. They saw a young black woman with a sharp tongue and mistook her passion for naivety. But those who knew her best understood, Jasmine's calm wasn't submission, it was the patience of someone who had learned to fight without losing her soul. Behind every fiery speech, there was a woman who had seen justice fail up close. Behind every poised answer, there was exhaustion buried under discipline. She knew what it meant to walk into rooms where her presence was treated like a disruption, and she stayed anyway. When the cameras came for her, when interviews and attacks became part of the job, Jasmine never softened her message. Representation, she said, isn't about being invited to the table. It's about flipping the table when it's built on exclusion. It was that same conviction that led her to the case now unfolding before the Supreme Court. The issue of voting rights wasn't abstract to her. It was personal, the culmination of everything she'd fought for in courtrooms, classrooms, and church basements. She'd seen what happened when ballots vanished, when precincts closed in the poorest neighborhoods, when people were told their voices didn't count. She'd seen democracy reduced to a privilege. In her mind, this hearing wasn't just another legal proceeding. It was the crossroads of her life's purpose, a confrontation between everything she believed and everything she'd spent her career resisting. And the irony wasn't lost on her, A man who had once benefited from the laws she now defended was standing ready to dismantle them. The night before the hearing, she sat alone in her hotel room, papers spread across the table, the city lights flickering through the blinds. The weight of history pressed against her chest. She wasn't afraid, not anymore, but she was aware. Aware that tomorrow she'd be walking into a chamber designed to intimidate, facing a justice who had made a career out of quiet dominance. She closed her notebook and whispered to herself, the same way her mother used to before every double shift, "You belong in this room." And as dawn broke over Washington, Jasmine Crockett walked into that marble fortress not as a guest, but as a reckoning, the product of every silenced voice now speaking through her. She'd been underestimated her whole life, but this time, she came armed with more than a speech, she had evidence. The chamber felt smaller now, its grandeur shrinking under the pulse of tension. Reporters leaned closer, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Justice Thomas adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the stack of papers before him, the gesture slow, deliberate, almost theatrical. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his tone steady but laced with condescension, "you argue that the oversight provisions of the Voting Rights Act remain necessary. Yet, data shows we've made significant progress. Do you truly believe the states cannot be trusted to govern themselves?" The words hung in the air, polished and heavy. Crockett folded her hands on the podium. "I believe," she said calmly, "that trust is earned by fairness, not declared by those who write the rules." Thomas leaned forward. "So your position is that this court, this institution, should police states indefinitely? How convenient for your side of the aisle." A few chuckles escaped from the conservative benches. Cameras flashed. But Crockett didn't blink. "No, Justice," she replied softly. "My position is that freedom doesn't expire just because it's inconvenient to supervise." The remark landed like a quiet detonation. The gallery stirred, pens scratched faster. Somewhere in the back, a reporter whispered, "She's pushing back." Thomas's expression hardened. "Congresswoman, you're not here to grandstand. You're here to clarify your brief." Crockett smiled faintly. Clarification is easy when truth isn't in dispute. For the first time, Thomas hesitated. His next words came sharper, defensive. "And what truth would that be?" "The truth," she said, her voice gaining weight, "that progress doesn't mean parity. That access to the ballot box is still determined by zip code, by color, by whose name sits on the county registrar's list. The truth that this very case exists because someone, somewhere, decided certain voices were expendable." The chamber murmured again, law clerks shifting, journalists exchanging glances. Thomas cleared his throat, regaining control. "Ms. Crockett," he said, "it's interesting how often you speak in moral absolutes. The Constitution, however, deals in law, not emotion." Crockett tilted her head slightly. "With respect, Justice, the Constitution was once used to justify slavery. Sometimes emotion is the only thing that reminds the law it's human. That did it." The silence afterward wasn't peace, it was electricity. Even the stenographer paused for half a second, her fingers hovering above the keys. Thomas exhaled through his nose, visibly unsettled. "We're not here for history lessons," he said curtly. "We're here to interpret legal intent." "Legal intent," she repeated, her eyes unwavering. "Tell that to the grandmother who walked 5 miles to vote because her polling station was closed. Or to the college students who waited in line for 9 hours while others walked straight in. Intent doesn't erase impact, Justice, it only hides behind it." His jaw tightened. The exchange had shifted. The once commanding Justice now looked like a man wrestling with control. The press gallery erupted in a flurry of whispers. Live blogs typed furiously. One headline was already forming in real time, "Crockett stands her ground as Thomas presses hard." Still, she remained unshaken. No raised voice, no theatrics. Just precision and poise, the kind that cuts deeper than anger ever could. Thomas tried one more time. "And tell me, Congresswoman, if the system is as broken as you claim, why do you have a seat in Congress at all?" The question was smug, almost triumphant. A murmur of approval rippled through his supporters. Crockett inhaled, exhaled slowly, her gaze never leaving him, "Because my ancestors built a nation that tried to forget them," she said. "And I refused to let it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even Thomas couldn't find his next line. Outside, the chants of protesters echoed faintly through the courthouse windows, a rhythmic call for justice that now seemed to score the room itself. And then, as the cameras panned from Thomas's tightened jaw to Crockett's calm stare, a new question appeared in the justice's notes. He looked down, frowned, and then glanced back at her. He cleared his throat once more. Congresswoman, he began, voice lower this time, if equality means perpetual oversight, what happens when oversight itself becomes tyranny? The reporters froze. Crockett raised her eyes, sensing the trap, feeling the tension twist. Then came the question that would flip the entire hearing on its head. The courtroom pulsed with a strange rhythm, a clash between stillness and tension. The marble walls, once symbols of permanence, now felt like mirrors reflecting the unease that hung between power and truth. Justice Thomas sat rigid in his chair, eyes narrowed, as if daring Jasmine Crockett to falter. She didn't, Congresswoman, he said, voice smooth but sharp at the edges. Do you believe federal oversight should indefinitely override the sovereignty of individual states? Crockett straightened. I believe oversight exists because sovereignty has too often been used as a shield for suppression. Thomas leaned in. So, you would argue that states are inherently untrustworthy? I'd argue, she said evenly, that trust isn't a birthright, it's a record. The gallery murmured. Flashbulbs went off in quick succession, bursts of light illuminating two faces separated by decades, ideology, and purpose. Thomas frowned, visibly displeased by her composure. Ms. Crockett, he continued, your statement implies a permanent stain upon the states, an assumption that no progress has been made. Isn't that cynical? Crockett didn't move. I call it realistic justice. My constituents don't measure progress by speeches, they measure it by ballots that actually get counted. A low ripple of agreement swept through the observers. Reporters began typing faster. Every word she spoke seemed to land with the precision of a gavel strike. Thomas shifted in his chair, irritated now. You speak of fairness, he said, but fairness demands equality under the law, not favoritism through intervention. Crockett nodded slightly, her tone never rising. Equality under the law is a promise that was broken long before I was born, and it's still being repaired. Oversight doesn't create favoritism, it enforces accountability. For a moment, Thomas said nothing. His silence was heavier than any outburst. The air in the chamber grew tight. The click of a camera echoed like thunder. He finally leaned back, eyes cold. Tell me, Congresswoman, how long must we atone for the sins of history? How many generations must carry that weight? Crockett's expression softened, not with pity, but understanding. Until history stops repeating itself, she said. The gallery stirred again. Someone in the press row whispered, she's winning this. Thomas's lips twitched into the faintest smile, the kind that hides discomfort behind confidence. You make eloquent speeches, Congresswoman, but law is not poetry. Emotion doesn't amend the Constitution. Crockett let the words hang. Then, quietly, maybe not. But empathy keeps it alive. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the clerks hesitated to breathe. Outside, protest chants filtered faintly through the windows, protect the vote, protect the voice. Inside, the fight continued, not just for legal precedent, but for the moral ground beneath it. Thomas adjusted his papers, perhaps to regain authority. And yet, he said, you stand here as a product of this very system you condemn. You were elected, were you not? Doesn't that prove the system works? Crockett met his gaze, calm as ever. It proves persistence works. The system didn't hand me this seat, Justice. People fought for it. They bled for it. The system just finally ran out of excuses not to let me in. A quiet gasp from the audience. Even one of the younger clerks looked up, visibly moved. Thomas exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing again. So you would have this court legislate morality? Crockett smiled faintly. No, sir. I'd have it remember it was built for the people, not over them. That line broke something in the air. The reporters were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses to a moral duel. Every camera was fixed, every social feed already alive with quotes. Thomas leaned back, speaking lower now, his tone a mix of irritation and curiosity. Then tell me, Congresswoman, if democracy requires such endless protection, doesn't that prove it's too fragile to survive on its own? The question slid through the room like a blade wrapped in silk. For a heartbeat, even Crockett was still. He looked at her, eyes steady, confident that he had finally cornered her. Every lens zoomed in. Every pen froze midair, and then came the question that would flip the entire hearing on its head. For a moment, it felt as though time had slowed to the rhythm of a single, steady heartbeat, hers. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to answer. She didn't flinch, fumble, or seek approval from the murmuring rows behind her. She simply lifted her gaze and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of power. Just as Thomas's question lingered in the air like smoke, if democracy requires such endless protection, doesn't that prove it's too fragile to survive on its own? Crockett finally spoke. Her tone was calm, deliberate, the voice of someone who had carried centuries of restraint in her chest. Fragile? She began softly. Democracy isn't fragile, Justice. People are. The Constitution wasn't written to protect power, it was written to protect the powerless from it. A flicker of motion, Thomas shifted in his seat. The clerks behind him stopped typing. Crockett opened her folder, revealing pages marked with yellow tabs and underlined passages. If I may, she said, I'd like to remind this court what fragility once looked like. She held up a printed excerpt. In Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, this court ruled that federal oversight of state elections was no longer necessary because, and I quote, the nation has changed. Her eyes lifted to meet his. But within months, states began closing polling stations in black neighborhoods, purging voter rolls, redrawing maps that carved communities apart. If that's what progress looks like, Justice, then the nation hasn't changed, it's just changed tactics. A rustle swept through the gallery. The sound was faint but electric, the sound of realization, of tension shifting sides. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett continued, her pace surgical. And when this court struck down those protections, it claimed that data didn't justify oversight. So I brought data. She reached into her stack, lifting a report. Between 2013 and 2020, more than 1,700 polling places were closed in predominantly minority districts. 1,700. In the name of efficiency. Democracy didn't crumble on its own, Justice, it was pushed. Camera shutters clicked. The gallery leaned forward as if pulled by gravity. Thomas frowned. Congresswoman, these numbers, Crockett interrupted, but gently. These numbers, she said, represent people. Elderly men who walked miles to vote. Mothers who took buses that no longer stopped near polling stations. College students told their IDs weren't valid because their dorms didn't count as homes. I know their names because they call my office every election season. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth itself had volume. Thomas's hands clasped tighter. Emotional appeals don't change constitutional interpretation. Then let's talk interpretation, she said smoothly. You speak of original intent. Let's read it together. She pulled out a small, worn booklet, the Constitution itself. Its cover was creased, pages folded from use. She flipped to the preamble and read aloud, to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Her eyes lifted, steady as steel. Now tell me, Justice, which part of that sounds temporary? The courtroom fell utterly silent. Even Thomas didn't answer. Crockett set the document down gently, her hand resting on it like it was sacred. You call oversight tyranny, she said. But tyranny isn't born from scrutiny, it's born from silence. And for far too long, too many Americans have been silenced under the illusion of equality. A soft gasp from somewhere in the audience. Thomas's expression stiffened, his mask cracking just slightly. Crockett took a breath, then turned her words into a blade of truth. You asked how long we must carry the sins of history. The answer is simple, as long as those sins keep repeating themselves. Until the weight of justice finally balances the scale. A clerk behind Thomas shifted nervously. The stenographer's hands trembled as she tried to keep up. The rhythmic tapping of keys became its own percussion, a pulse of history being recorded in real time outside. The crowd's chants echoed faintly through the walls, merging with the heartbeat-like hum in the chamber. The words were indistinct, but their energy was unmistakable. Thomas tried again, his voice clipped. The court must interpret law, not sentiment. What you're offering is political theater. Crockett smiled, the kind of smile that says you just made my point for me. And yet, Justice, the court has always been theater. Every ruling, every dissent, every word from that bench has shaped the story of who matters in this country. You call it interpretation. History calls it narrative. Reporters froze, realizing they'd just heard the soundbite that would dominate every headline. Thomas inhaled slowly, visibly wrestling for control. But Crockett pressed on, her calm sharpening into clarity. I stand here because my constituents can't afford another ruling that treats their right to vote as negotiable. And you sit there because they once couldn't. That line hit like thunder. The air fractured, the gallery gasped audibly. Even some of the justices on the bench shifted, discomfort flickering across their faces. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just lowered her tone, speaking like someone explaining truth to time itself. You once said, the Constitution says what it says. I agree. But it also means what it meant, and what it meant, justice, was all men are created equal. Not some. Not later. Not when convenient. All. A wave of emotion swept through the room, reporters blinking hard, activists clutching their pens like prayer beads. Somewhere in the back row, an older woman whispered, "That's our voice." Crockett took a final breath. If democracy is fragile, then maybe that's because it keeps being tested by those sworn to protect it. The question isn't whether it can survive without oversight, it's whether those in power can survive being held accountable. She closed her binder, every motion deliberate, final. The sound of paper meeting would echo like a gavel. For a long, unbearable second, no one moved. Even Justice Thomas stared at her as though trying to find the flaw that wasn't there, and then, the room shifted. Reporters typed furiously. Phones lit up. The first headlines were already forming, flashing in red banners across digital screens. Crockett strikes back, Supreme Court showdown stuns nation. Calm, precise, unbreakable. History speaks softly, but she spoke louder. Crockett gathered her notes, her face unreadable, her posture unshaken. By the time she finished, the chamber would never sound the same again. When the gavel finally fell, the sound felt smaller than it should have, a single wooden tap swallowed by the enormity of what had just happened. Inside, the marble chamber sat frozen in stunned silence. Clerks avoided eye contact. Reporters lingered in disbelief, unsure whether to whisper or to run for the door. Justice Thomas gathered his papers with mechanical calm, his expression unreadable. Jasmine Crockett simply exhaled. One deep breath, measured, steady, as if she were anchoring the entire room back to gravity. Outside, the world erupted. Within minutes, clips of her final line, "The Constitution wasn't written to protect power, but the powerless from it," flooded every platform. The hashtag Crockett Clash ignited, trending in 20 countries within the hour. TikTok edits set her voice against swelling music. On Twitter, users stitched together side-by-side shots of her composure and Thomas's unease. A generation that had grown up doubting whether politics could still inspire found itself watching the same 30 seconds over and over. MSNBC analysts replayed the footage in slow motion, dissecting tone and tempo like a masterclass in poise. CNN aired it under the headline, "The Moment That Shook the Court." Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore it. They framed it as a dangerous rise of courtroom activism, but their clips still went viral. Celebrities weighed in. A-list actors, civil rights icons, young activists, their posts formed a mosaic of affirmation. A Hollywood producer tweeted, "That wasn't politics. That was poetry with a subpoena." A best-selling author wrote, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar." Musicians remixed her closing line into protest anthems overnight. It wasn't just commentary anymore, it was culture in motion. In law schools, professors interrupted their lectures to stream the full exchange. Students sat transfixed, watching history unspool in real time. In small towns, church groups gathered after service to talk about the woman who had stood her ground before the highest court in the land. And in cities across the country, street murals began to appear, her silhouette in grayscale against the backdrop of a folded constitution, her quote painted in bold beneath, "All means all." Meanwhile, inside the court, the air remained unnervingly still. The justices had retreated behind closed doors. The echo of Crockett's words still clung to the walls like heat after lightning. The same reporters who moments earlier had been holding their breath now stormed into the sunlight, shouting into microphones, their words tripping over adrenaline. "Congresswoman Crockett just redefined the tone of constitutional debate," one correspondent declared on the courthouse steps. What we saw inside wasn't just argument, it was a moral turning point. The clip went live. Millions watched. Millions believed by nightfall, late-night hosts were quoting her line as both satire and sermon. Think tanks published emergency papers within hours, dissecting every angle. Was this the start of a new populist legal era or the rebirth of civic courage? One conservative scholar warned, if emotion dictates law, we lose order. A progressive counterpart countered, if empathy is absent from law, we lose humanity. But for everyday people, it wasn't theory. It was vindication. For those who'd stood in lines for hours just to vote, who'd been told their IDs weren't valid, who'd watched districts vanish through redrawn maps, Crockett's calm defiance felt like justice finally speaking their language. In living rooms across the country, the footage replayed, Thomas leaning forward, Crockett steady as a mountain. One moment of restraint, multiplied into millions of screens, each viewer seeing something of themselves reflected in her silence, and while the internet burned with analysis, Crockett stayed quiet. No press tweets, no interviews. Just the stillness of someone who understood that true power doesn't perform, it endures. When she finally emerged from the courthouse hours later, the crowd outside had doubled. Protesters, supporters, camera crews, a human tide pulsing with collective awe. Flashbulbs painted her in white light. She walked to the podium slowly, her face unreadable. Then, softly, she spoke. This was never about me, she said. It's about the right to be counted. The crowd fell silent. Phones rose like candles, she continued, voice low but unshaken. Democracy is not fragile because of who votes, it's fragile because of who stops believing their vote matters. Our job isn't to protect power. It's to remind it where it came from. Her words hung in the night air, heavier than any headline. Behind her, the dome of the court glowed faintly in the darkness, marble turned ghostly under the spotlights, a monument to both justice and contradiction. The chants began again, slow and rhythmic this time. Count every voice. Count every voice. Somewhere in that crowd, a teenager held up a handmade sign, she spoke for us. A journalist snapped a photo. Within an hour, it became the new face of the movement. Crockett looked out over the crowd, the tired, the hopeful, the disbelieving, and offered a small, almost private smile. This fight didn't end today, she said. It just became visible. Then she stepped back, letting the chant swell until it drowned the hum of cameras. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating, she was warning what comes next.